Yo everyone, welcome back to the Lost Tangent Outpost. I'm Spada, and you've made it to the MULTIVERSUS living roster. Before we get too far into the video, I'll explain what the living roster is for any newcomers. The living roster is an ever-changing prediction where I present you options for characters that we think are likely to make it into MULTIVERSUS, and you, the community, vote on which characters make the most sense. If you want to get involved in this discussion or even just offer up some ideas in between episodes, use the hashtag #MVSLivingRoster on Twitter. Instead of just explaining what the living roster is, let's go ahead and demonstrate it by discussing last episode's results. Last episode, I presented you all with 5 options for villains that we should expect to be the ones represented by these portals next to Joker on the Iron Throne from the launch trailer. I asked you which of these 5 characters are least likely to make it into MULTIVERSUS, and here are the results of that poll. Last episode, we got 242 votes. That's awesome. Honestly, that's about 10% of everyone who watched the video, and that's a pretty decent ratio. But I think we can do better, so if you didn't vote last week, please make sure to do so this week. It looks like Darkseid was voted the least likely. So with that, let's go ahead and add the other 4 to our current living roster. But as I told you all last week, this is not all. I asked you all to get involved in the comments and tell me what you thought of my character choices, and I was stoked to see so many comments. So I'd like to highlight and respond to my favorite comments from last week's video. First is a longtime viewer and subscriber who goes by Holland Movies on YouTube. He said, "I feel like having specifically Darkseid or any of the DC villains in this set of characters undermines Joker as the big bad of the game, or at least this season, and this to me makes Darkseid by far the least likely." I think this is a super fair point. It's something I hadn't even really considered, to be honest. And with this logic, it makes it much easier to keep Darkseid shelved until a later date when we feel like he has more relevance. The next one comes from one of our newer subscribers, Adam Gregory 03, who says, "Kinda surprised you didn't bring up either Mojo Jojo or him. A Powerpuff Girls villain honestly seems pretty likely to me. They're giving it a new stage and a ton of fan service already, and I could see a situation where we get one of their bad guys this season. Then next season we get the girls themselves with a trailer where they're beating them up." Now, I've already replied to him directly in terms of his surprise that Mojo Jojo wasn't included, but I want to iterate that in this video too. I absolutely think Mojo Jojo and or him make fantastic options for villainous characters for MULTIVERSUS. And I also totally acknowledge that him existing in the background of the Townsville stage is not a good reason to exclude him as an option. I generally come into these videos with a few preconceived ideas as to who we'll be talking about, and in this case, the first 3 I decided on before I even started the script. The last 2, Aku and Spinell, were brought up to me on Twitter, and I thought they were fantastic options and covered multiple IPs from the WB catalog. With all that said, let's get into the main topic of today's video. You see, Darkseid was the most voted for, but there was a second character that got almost as many votes as he did, and that was Aku. And the reasons people voted for him were vast, but almost all of them boiled down to he seems like a better option as a Rift boss. And I think that's totally fair. For now, he holds one of the spots in our living roster, but today's episode might change that. Today, we're going to be deciding whether to keep Aku or to replace him with one of 4 other characters. These characters were mostly recommended by you guys in the comments, and I've also included one of my own just to see how you guys feel about it. Let's start it out with Mojo Jojo.
That is correct. It is I, Mojo Jojo.
I guess I should start his section off by reiterating that a character's inclusion in other portions of the game, such as stages, banners, ring-out explosions, icons, is not in any way indicative of whether or not they could be included as characters. Tony has explained this to us already. So despite his existence on the Townsville stage, it is still a very real possibility that he could appear as a playable character. Mojo Jojo, if you don't know, is basically the main villain of the Powerpuff Girls cartoon. He's not always the villain of the episode, but he is most of the time. As such, he's contested the girls' power many times with his litany of gadgets and schemes. He's also insanely silly and absurd, leaving plenty of room for gags to be built into his moveset, included in his voice lines, or animated as taunts. He also gives us another non-human character, which is a category in MULTIVERSUS that isn't actually that populated yet. And since rifts often include challenges to be a node with characters of different categories, it makes sense to expand that one. Next up, let's discuss Black Hat.
Oh, Lord Black Hat.
Well.
Black Hat is basically the boss villain from the animated show Villainous. Now, my knowledge on this show is very limited. I've done my best to kind of speedrun what I could find of this show and of Black Hat himself. The cartoon itself, as I understand it, had some issues getting its release in the US, but natively comes from Mexico. It's kind of like Bizarro Justice Friends, because it's all about a group of villains that work under Black Hat's organization to help independent villains deal with their heroic adversaries. Speaking on Black Hat specifically, he doesn't actually do much in the way of attacking throughout the show as far as I could tell. There are instances of him punishing his underlings or other characters, but most of those are handled by some method that doesn't include actual combat, like sucking someone into a black puddle in the ground or teleporting them by squishing them into a small point and then making them reappear the opposite way. But in all cases where he is animated, it's done in some really awesome ways. Similar to Aku, he kind of glides around the ground as a puddle of ink sometimes. Apparently, he also has doppelgangers too, which could enable some interesting stance change mechanics to him. I think if he was to make it, he would have to be more of a passive mage-like character who has almost no close-up melee attacks. Alright, and for this next one, I want to discuss Freddy Krueger.
Come to Freddy.
Ah, yes, this character. He's actually one I've avoided since the original Multiversus Living roster because, honestly, just his appearance is gory. Nah, look, let's be real. If Jason can make it in, so can Freddy. Freddy, like Jason, is a bit of a weird one in terms of rights. I would call him a second-party character, which is to say, a character that WB's name is attached to given that New Line Cinema has been the production company behind most of the Nightmare on Elm Streets, if not all, and New Line Cinema is owned by WB. But I do not think that WB directly owns the rights to Freddy Krueger. Despite that, they've used their connection before to have Freddy in Mortal Kombat 9, so it seems plausible at the very least that he can make it. In terms of moves, oh man, the amount of options is just crazy. Freddy Krueger has been around for a very long time, almost as long as Jason, and he's got almost as many movies. In all of those movies, the amount of different creative ways that Freddy Krueger has attacked or even killed his victims is staggering. And given that, as a character, he operates primarily by using dreams to manipulate his victims and accomplish unfathomable feats, his moveset could be super outlandish. He can bring spikes from the ground, transform and shapeshift himself, throw his claws. He'd make a fantastic brawler or assassin. Honestly, as long as they get permission for him, Krueger is absolutely filled to the brim with good options for an awesome and fun character. And finally, let's discuss Dr. Evil.
Daddy's back.
Yes, that Dr. Evil, the Austin Powers villain. Austin Powers was also produced by New Line Cinema, and thus the IP has some pretty straightforward connections to Warner Brothers. There's also a fourth Austin Powers movie that is currently in the works, which means that Warner might actually have additional reasons to consider bringing the character back to the forefront of conversation. He's also one of the most hilarious villains in movie history, which makes for some really fun opportunities for extra hilarity in ring-out explosions and banners. In terms of moves, there aren't many times where he's in direct confrontation with anyone, but there are plenty of situations where he utilizes his environment, gadgets, and hidden doors to attack his enemies. If they want to be super interesting, he could even utilize sharks with laser beams on their heads as a move.
You know, I have one simple request, and that is to have sharks with frickin' laser beams attached to their heads.
There are also a bunch of hilarious gags from the movies that I could see them utilizing as attacks as well. Alright, so those are your 4 new choices. So out of these 5, who do you think most deserves a spot in Aku's position on our living roster? Aku himself, Mojo Jojo, Freddy Krueger, Black Hat, or Dr. Evil? To cast your vote, I've put a link on the iCards here, and you can use that to navigate to the community page where the poll is. And make sure that you subscribe if you're not already so you can gain even easier access to this and other polls. If you have anything to add, if you think I got anything wrong, or if you just want to explain your reasoning behind your vote, make sure to get involved in the comment section down below. As with this episode, I will pick my favorite comments from this episode to respond to in the next one. I just want to thank you all again for coming by and watching this video. Thank you also for just being a part of my community. All right, that's everything I had. Have a great one, and until next time.